Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first appointment of archives, possible itineraries. This is the first event of a cycle of program that we organized for the 30th anniversary of the passing of Luigi Ghirri, which happened tomorrow on the 14th of February. We thank you for your presence here. I would like to give the microphone to the mayor, 𝗭𝗂𝗃𝗃𝗏. First of all, good evening to everybody. Welcome. First of all, I would like to thank the people who will speak during this panel, which will give life to such an important evening. I would like to thank all the people who, together with us, contributed to organize this event, and also the next events that will be part of the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the death of Luigi Ghirri. So first of all, I would like to thank the region of Emilia-Romagna, and I would like to thank the other towns of Emilia that will carry on with this project. 30 years after the disappearing of one of the most important personalities of this city, we couldn't avoid taking care of an important cultural project that goes beyond a celebration, that is sort of an itinerary of exploring the thought and the work of Luigi Ghirri. This goes beyond the ritual of celebration, which needs to be, of course, but we want to also rediscover and go in depth in thinking and in the work, and to live it through contemporaneity, and to learn something, a lesson, a stimulation, to look towards the future. And I say this, especially in this moment, after 2 years that have been very difficult for us, that created a sense of community that is very fragile and that needs culture, creativity, and public discussion in order to keep alive the relationships in a society and in a city. And I think that by doing this, by exploring the artistic and cultural work that Luigi Ghirri left us, is, as a matter of fact, something we needed to do, this town needed to do, and we are doing it together with you, and all the people will be next to us, trying to leave a trace of these 30 years. Thank you very much. Enjoy your conference. Good afternoon from me. I am Annalisa Rabiti. I'm the City Commissioner for Culture of this town, and it's such a great honor to be here today to give life to this 30th anniversary. I think that one of the main aims of our administration is to preserve. And since we speak about archives, archiving and preserving is extremely important. We have such a gigantic archive here with 180,000 items from Luigi Ghirri, and we do this through the museum and the library. But we also do this through events, because we want archives to be something living, talking to us nowadays. When we speak about Luigi Ghirri, we speak about a person who showed us a new way of seeing things and to see beyond things, which is also a quote that we chose to give a line to these 30 years. And we invite ourselves to always look at the past work, to visit it and to look at it with new eyes, because by using new eyes we can work in the present, and we can work with new generations. The exhibition here at the museum is trying to give such a narrative, and this is the kind of work we will do this year. We want to try to understand how to look at the present day with new eyes. Luigi Ghirri was one of the most important authors of our city, and he taught us how to look at our town and how to be proud of our identity as Reggio Emilia people, which is in a territory that is becoming more and more important also internationally. I never personally met Luigi Ghirri. I was a young child when he passed away, but I did have to study for an exam with Master 𝗙𝗀𝗃𝗏, who introduced me to this photographer, which I loved very much from the very first moment. So to me, it's really moving to be here as a city commissioner to honor this 30th anniversary. I would like to thank also some institutions who took part to this project, Parma and Modena, two towns which are part together with us to the project of 3 towns, which is something that will be soon announced. And I think this is beautiful because 3 cities that Luigi Ghirri lived through are going to work together. I would like to thank the Photothek and the Civic Museum of Reggio Emilia and all the people in the Office for Culture, because there are so many people who work behind me, and this is very important. And also I would like to thank the family of Luigi, who is here, and also Palazzo Magnani, who offered us the graphics that you have seen around the city. We did this within our efforts, and I think this is of great value. I hope I didn't forget anyone, and I would like to leave the word to our guests, which will be with us for the rest of the day. This is a very important day. Thank you very much. I would like to invite to the table Francesco 𝗔𝗿𝗃𝗏, who will be curating this meeting, but also 𝗟𝗶𝗶𝗏𝗿, who is an author and a writer and a literary critic, Armin Link, who is a photographer and a filmmaker, Linda Frejny, who is an artist, and 𝗙𝗿𝗏𝗏𝗏, an historian of photography, and Francesco Garrutti, the curator of the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, and the word goes to 𝗟𝗶𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. Very well. I decided to speak about one item that is very interesting to me, which is time. This short talk is about the suspended time of Luigi Ghirri. I would like to start by the first image, which is a very well-known work. Let's see if it can be shown. This is a 1974 work, Infinite, which you probably know because it's something that has been created over 365 days. In the short text that Luigi Ghirri prepared to present this work, Luigi Ghirri says that he never really loved these kind of pictures of the sky, but it does represent to him the impossibility of translating natural science. So what are these 365 photographs? They express the link between space and time. The sky is the space, of course, and 365 is the chronological time. This is in a certain sense, and I'm going to use Mikhail Bakhtin's 1937 expression, and this Russian expert, he said this is a chronotopo, which is the representation of time in literature. In the case of Ghirri, we can actually speak about literature, visual literature. There's an element, a storytelling element, that is so important in his work, just like he explained in the photographic lessons. And in 1989, in this very important book, essay about the Italian landscape, well, it was called The Profile of Clouds. I would like to start from the text of Gianni Celati, who passed away recently. Gianni wrote a text that was very important to us, and it's still important and relevant. Of course, he wrote it in his own literal style, with his underlying tones that he always uses. He wrote about Luigi Ghirri, each picture, even though related to a contingent occasion, it actually is linked to another picture, another shot that needs to be taken or will be taken or was taken. This is a series of contingent statuses, passages from one moment to the next one. Well, I do believe that in this sentence there is the issue that I would like to talk about, and I will go over it very shortly, but space, time, contingency, and storytelling. This is the four elements that really explain the photography of Luigi Ghirri. And again, I would like to quote Celati. He said, "We could say that a suspended time," is speaking about Luigi Ghirri, the suspended time goes by, it goes away every day like clouds that navigate by altering their own shape in a weird suspension. Clouds represent this time that Celati calls suspended, a non-linear time that doesn't go in any specific direction without any specific goal. It is difficult to say when one cloud starts and the other one will end. It is almost impossible to find an order or a distinction in moments of time that goes away, slip away every day. When we flip through infinite, we have this sense of moments that are suspended through images. These images do not represent an irresistible time. This is a time that is renewed at each shot, just like Celati wrote in the profile of clouds. And it is the contrary of what Roland Barthes expressed in his photography book, wrote. Celati considers Ghirri as someone who is able to renew time in every accidental shot. And each shot renews the perception, and this is a sentence by Celati, instead of being sort of a final stone, it is a moment of life. Roland Barthes considers photography as something that has been, but Luigi Ghirri is about what will be. This is the incantation of time. It would be interesting to speak about the incantation of time. We see now a few pictures very quickly. This is a painting by Walter-Iotti, who is the relative of Luigi Ghirri. And it is something that he recalled at the beginning of the profile of clouds. As you can see, this is a large street, and there is something that is incredible, which is memory. Maybe this street, which is part of the issue of memory, it is part of something that has already been seen by Luigi Ghirri, meaning something that has already been thought, already been imagined, already been dreamed of. This we could go on a beautiful excursus about the theme of fantastic. And it's something that really emanates from the pictures, from these photographs. Incantation and fantastic. Incantation is to say magic words. When we are in front of these pictures, we ask ourselves, where have I seen this already? There is something magical that is the beginning of those images that hit on us without giving us pain, that touch us without a bouleversement. And this goes to the next item, memory. And the idea of memory was always there, even in the last moments of the photography of Luigi Ghirri. Even as he wasn't shooting, thinking in terms of books, but in terms of open spaces, the landscape around him, the snowy or foggy landscape that surrounded and still surrounds his home in Ronconcesi near Reggio. In Nothing Old Under the Sun, Luigi Ghirri expresses the idea of fantastic, which is perfectly linked to the idea of landscape. And it is within this mutation, this passage from a fairy tale world to the fantastic world, that we can explain the air of troubled tranquility that lives in these places, these landscapes that are lived through mystery. This theme of time, which I will not spend much time on, but there would be so much to say about, Time condensates in its photographs, and it's a time that stays on the threshold between two feelings. There is the temporal dimension of past, which is the time when the picture was shot, but also the dimension of the future, when the image will be looked at. And these two time frames that we distinguish are mixed with the present. We look at them right now, in this moment, in our present, in this place, Reggio Emilia, and we give time a fluctual character. We can say that the reality, the time reality, gives to the work of Luigi Ghirri some suspension sense. It is not by chance that a theme, an important theme for him, is fog, which is present in many of his images. There are two pictures that are in his books. Let's see if I can find them. There are two pictures taken in Brest. This is not the fog, but there is this element of opacity. This woman is against a glass, and then there are some sailors on the other side of the same glass. These are pictures that are on his photography lessons that he showed to his students. Luigi Ghirri wrote, the photographer works with something that is opaque, because the image creates itself and reveals itself in the dark. And yet we use items that are transparent, like the frames. So the perception of reality is very peculiar when it results from this process. What is this perception of reality? It is the theme of the moment. As Luigi Ghirri explains in the lessons, in his photographic lessons, he explains that photography is something that has to do with looking for the best moment to shoot. It's never between midday and the early afternoon. That light is not good for him. And as Luigi Ghirri explains to his students, he speaks about the moment, this split moment. This is not about the specific moment of Cartier-Bresson, which is the time that imprisons time that has already gone by. For Ghirri, the time is not something stable or constant. It is about the threshold between the past and the future. These are images of thresholds that open up. For him, the moment is not something constant, it's between past and future. And it includes within itself these two times. And that's why we can see the world through different eyes. What has been and what will be. Time, that moment becomes suspended time in that relationship between space and time. Luigi Ghirri's photographs are not mere photographs, they are images. He explains it in his first page of the lessons. He explains to the students, even though he doesn't use photograph, he says images. Each photograph, each video clip is advertisement, each movie, etc., and also pictures and sculptures. They interact with other languages, meaning that the artist or the producer is always influenced by this object. So this is not about the definition. It is clear that we are looking at pictures and photographs, but these are images that are the result, the summary of different times that stay within the photograph. When we look at images by Luigi Ghirri, we are also within the time, but which kind of time are we talking about? It's our inner time, a constant flux. The present is a process, as Huxley said. It opens up paradoxically between being quiet and being in a chaos. We are looking at what the author of the image photographed, and it's time that fluctuates, that it's in a flux. These are still thresholds that are very attractive to Luigi Ghirri. as you see in this picture, this is also a picture that is in the lessons of photography. What is this showing? One time 𝗔𝗿𝗃𝗏 said something very beautiful. He said, you know, as I showed these pictures, like this one, which is the school of San Maurizio in Reggio, with these open doors, I showed it abroad to people who were working in the field of photography, and the experts said, but this is a naive. Well, it is so. 𝗏𝗏𝗵𝗵𝗏𝗏, the Benati house. This is also a picture that has been taken through a door frame. This is a bedroom. And of course he explains how the symmetry of this space, this white, this wall that opens up to the next wall, how important they are. The threshold, which is a big item, big theme for him, it's something that makes evident what we dream and what we imagined. There is something about dreamlike in this. The threshold is a unique moment, which in Luigi Ghirri's pictures takes this, the shape of waiting. The most beautiful thresholds are the ones that open up to something over there in a field, in the countryside. The threshold is something that opens up to something else, which is the external world. Also, external world is important. And also the window that looks like something waiting. It's a mirror to a world. It's a reflection of the world, and yet the window is a window on the world. You understand how space plays an important part. Well, empty space. This is never a space that is full in his pictures. This is a space that we cannot perceive because everything is full. We are always looking at our phones, smartphones, which is an intense space. It's a space without space. But Luigi, who lived his life in the countryside, most of his life, in the Po Valley next to the hills, he has this imprinting that is very important. And this is a sentence by 𝗔𝗏𝗃𝗏. He was able to tell the fixation of the void, of a space that we cannot understand. We take for granted the understanding of the space of our homes, or the places that we inhabit usually. And we don't see it anymore. But here, even in this picture of this bedroom, by Daniele Benati's bedroom, we see space, we see everything. We see what needs to be there and what needs to be seen. And this is something that always struck me. You see that those clothes hanging down there, that shirt. What emerges from the photographs of Luigi Ghirri is the contingency, the happy contingency of being in the world and living in our randomness, our contingency through always constant changing sight. This is something aesthetic. He said this very often, and 𝗔𝗏𝗃𝗏 repeated it. Over with aesthetics. He always said, these are not aesthetic pictures. I'm afraid of going through too many connections without explaining myself too much, but the connection to the outside world by Luigi Ghirri has something to do with contingency. Conscience, as a philosopher wrote, the conscience is not within this, because the conscience is about something that is out there in the world within things and people. 𝗔𝗏𝗃𝗏 often speaks about the state of contingency, this passage from one moment to the next one. Luigi said, you cannot take the same picture, always the same picture, in different moments. The light will change. The small difference in light, 1 minute to the next one, is the contingency that forces me to shoot the shot. And one last word, the theme of storytelling. This would require a lecture by itself. It has to do with the issue of time and space, but especially time. The photography by Luigi is a storytelling. even though very much tied to the contingency of a moment. It has to do with another picture or with other pictures that need to be shot, or pictures that need to be imagined, or pictures that have been seen. No picture is ever by itself. They are all in a series, not necessarily in the same place or with the same theme. These pictures are series. I'm thinking of the pictures that are spread out in his books, which are a narrative, a storytelling. And these pictures can change the storytelling. If we change their order, everything changes, because there's a rhythm. And what really hit 𝗙𝗏𝗃 in this diary that opens the book that they did together, they made together, where Gianni wrote, it is the succession and juxtaposition of photos. He worked by placing the pictures in different order, following the kind of storytelling he wanted to say. Just like in the Middle Age, when we tell a story, it's a series of images. And these stories might not be adventures. Actually, there rarely are. Just like the contingency of storytelling, of non-adventurous storytelling, well, I chose this picture, which is one of the most beautiful ones, the most passionate ones. This Bologna gas pump with this evening light and this neon light. Who would take a picture like this? And why this object? So I would like to finish by quoting from another book in which we talk about transparency. And Luigi Ghirri speaks about a memory, a childhood memory by Ingmar Bergman, who discovered movies as a young child, hiding in a closet, and he did that by looking through the little holes of the closet. Well, photography is like that for Luigi Ghirri. It is seeing through something. It is not only lenses or frameworks. It is the appearing of images in the little tanks where you develop pictures. And he concluded by saying that this gigantic emporium of small, incredible objects are there just to represent a few shadows or an image of the external world, aware that everything seems and is thanks to the transparency of light. Thank you. Thank you, Marco. I'm very happy to introduce and to give the word to people in these lectures, in this panel, from the introduction by 𝗙𝗏𝗃𝗏. As you know, today we will speak about archives, and many of the keywords that he figured out are obviously part of the context of the universe of archives. Time is one of the main characters of this system, but also contingency, also space. Archives are places. Some of our lecturers will talk about the materiality of archives. So starting from this, I would like to talk together with you about archives being inspired by the relationship between Luigi Ghirri and his own archive, which is the materials, images first of all, but not only, that he accumulated on his tables, in his shelves, in his study and in his home, in his study home. As we will see in the next events of this series, the work of Ghirri, his poetry, his approach, or maybe we should say his different approaches, constitute the starting point to investigate practices, issues that were the center of his work. And we would like to look at it together, to look at the state of art and the variations and the updates. How did these archives evolve? And how did the thinking, the living thinking of Ghirri keeps on nourishing new researches and new possibilities? So with our guests, we don't want to talk only about Luigi Ghirri, but also to start from Ghirri. And in order to speak about archives, we have lecturers who work with this, with different points of view, perspectives. We have two artists that took the archive as the center of their research, both when it was time to look for or to use or change, sign, or to chew again images like Linda Fregnagel does, but also thinking in terms of accumulation, of noting, of writing down of self-images, like Armin Link does. And then we have two curators who will speak about both archives as institutions and how to constitute an archive as gravity center that allow activities to work in a research center. And this is what we will talk about with Francesco Garutti from the CCA of Montreal. And also we will talk about archives as reality and its possible strategies to reactivate materials that are contained within itself, its contents, its objects, that can be put into new practice, and there are so many, and 𝗏𝗏 will talk about this. So I will give you the word, but before we start, I would like to say a few words about the relationship between Luigi Ghirri and his own archive, starting from a concept that was fundamental. It is fundamental in his writings too, in his lessons too, as he mentioned times and times over. This concept is about that his own images could be taken back, reseen, reused in different occasions within different projects, making his own archive, what he accumulated until that moment, a container that was always opened. This idea of openness is extremely important. He uses it many times. He says open very often. So this open container is something that he can reach into over and over again. Many people who studied Ghirri thought about this, thinking of 𝗏𝗏 and Massimo Mussini. And also we can think of the 1979 exhibition in Parma, where different series by Ghirri of the 70s were put together. But I'm thinking also of Merita Ranelli. She also worked a lot on this point. In 1978, there is an important passage from this point of view. Ghirri, within 𝗏𝗏, reorganizes 92 photos, which are mainly not taken for this photo book. They have been chosen by going through his own archive as a huge range of images without distinguishing the time in which they were taken. So there are photographs from the very early days of his photographic profession until the last ones that he took in 1978. And within this book, there are new images, but also previously unpublished photos, but there are also photographs that are recycled, we could say. This is very important. Ghirri introduces a new concept, which is the ecological side of images. Images can be taken and used again. Recently, I worked to a 𝗙𝗲𝗏𝗏's exhibition. He used to say, photographs can be used over and over again. They can be put back into the cycle. The borders or the limits of Ghirri's projects are very mobile. They are liquid, and they facilitate the intersection, the recombination between them. They can be united within themselves. And images, from this point of view, are units of meaning, visual and meaning units, just like the words of our language. They can be remixed through an ars combinatoria, and that creates a composition that is always new and producing, ever-producing combination. So we will speak about this with our lecturers, but these images for Ghirri are alive, they are organisms, and they can always be reactivated and put into movement. And just one last word, I would like to quote another sentence by Ghirri. Ghirri didn't believe especially in the single image. Marco mentioned this also in his introduction. He said that there is an idea of storytelling. Ghirri believed in the constitution of sequences of images, groups of images. Today we would say clusters of images, able to create or to sparkle a potential, an infinite potential. And he made a very special example in one of his essays, The Open Work, again about openness. So Borges speaks about a painter who would like to paint the world, and he starts to make a painting with lakes and mountains and trees and all the possible objects. And at the end of his life, he puts together all these images, and it turns out that this melange is actually his face. Well, I thought that this project, this photographic project, was similar to this storytelling, trying to find a structure for every single image, meant to have a structure for the next image. This is the infinite concept, the concept of never-ending work. So the portrait that Borges speaks about is not an ending point, it's an image that is a starting point in itself, it's a fragment. So every image in the pattern book of Ghirri is just like a prelude, a starting point to start again. It's an hymn to the liveliness of images that will be the main character of tonight. And I apologize for such a long introduction, but I would like to give the word to Armin Linke, who will tell us about, who will start from his own work. This is, through this you can choose the pictures you want to show. And I think my introduction is a good introduction to your speech. So first of all, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Of course, I'm very honored to be able to speak here because, of course, Ghirri is the reason why I became a photographer. Ghirri existed, his photo books existed, and his method existed, which in my biography was very important. It's a new method, it was a new method to have an analytic system, a free analytic system, a playful analytic system, and maybe with an historical reference that is open. And it allowed us to create photographs that are open to many different interpretations. So I would like not to show my photographs, but to show installation methods, settings, photographic settings, installations that start from a mass of images that I produced And I would like to show ways to include the audience, the public, to recompose them. Like this exhibition at the Triennale 15 years ago, where I asked a series of architects to create these wheels, in the idea that these pictures coming from different voyages, coming from different places, they were printed on these Rolodexes. I don't know if you remember, it was where you would put the addresses. And these magical lanterns, in a sense, were there to be pushed in the space, and you would activate the pictures and the storytelling and the sequences by pushing on the wheels. Of course, sometimes there were some accidents. Wheels would hit against each other. Another installation in Karlsruhe, Germany, where I chose, or pre-chose, 1,000 photographs from my archives, and I printed them out in the original shape on cardboard, and visitors could touch them, which was something very complicated, of course, because we had to ensure these images. So this is a work of art that is put into discussion by being touched by manual abilities. And this exhibition would move on this wall. The visitors were like curators, and the exhibition would increase, would grow as visitors came by. So the photographs had a barcode, and the system was able to understand which pictures had been chosen, and they were printed out in a booklet that was given as a present to the visitors. The same exhibition traveled. This is in Sao Paulo. And such a project is also a project that is only possible through the collaboration with students of Karlsruhe, students of curatorial design, and also with the help of the Foreign Artificial Intelligence Lab of Paris, and also it was financed by a science project by the European Union. And the main theme was tagging. How do you describe a picture through words? And the visitors could also decide what the title was of each image. So at the end, we had 30,000 sequences, 30,000 series, we can say, and the printer was a card printer. This is the Admont library, a Baroque library, and this machine producing books in a place that is an archive of books since the 17th century. At one point with Peter, we wondered how could we create a book out of this performance. And at that point, we started choosing sequences, and we started seeing 30,000 PDFs produced by the visitors, and we wanted to choose some. Of course, after half a day, we had a huge headache, and this project is always, such a project is always an excuse to create a new project, and I asked Peter to create a new algorithm that would choose on our behalf sequences out of the sequences chosen by the visitors. And this was a test to try to understand what are the algorithms that we use every day, like by using Google Images. And Peter told me we could use the most simple one, that is the Markov analysis, which is at the basis of statistics. He tried to explain it to me, and I couldn't understand anything, of course, and this was lost in translation totally. So we decided to include a scientific paper that was explaining the rules of permutation and choice, and the book was a graphic translation of these sequences chosen by algorithms written by Peter. And this is some of the images. Of course, there was also a system about colors and other methods. The images you see come from different projects, previous projects that ended up in my archive. Another important collaboration was a project with Bruno Latour, who is a philosopher, a science philosopher, an anthropologist of science, who had this idea of a book, an inquiry into modes of existence, something that existed without notes, while the notes were on this website. As he developed this book, he wanted to understand how pictures, films, or work of art could become visual notes, footnotes. And together with Leclerc and the graphic Donato Ricci, here we are at the Media Lab in the St. Paul's University in Paris. They wanted to understand how these pictures could be part of the graphic interface of the project. So I chose once again 2,000 photos from my archive. I printed them out from my Xerox machine. And at that point, it was interesting for me to see how they would choose the photos, not following my agenda, but to illustrate some themes. And I was very stuck. For example, this is a description of a lab, scientific lab, and there is also something about the difference between a collection and an archive, or how to use architecture to describe a political space. This was so interesting to me that I asked Latour whether I could use some of the texts that he wrote about these images, to describe these images, in my own project, my own exhibition, that I repeated, and I repeated the same with other actors. 𝗏𝗏, who is a geologist, Farinelli, Lena Zulai, 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏. So the exercise was not to say this is my own photograph and my reading of the world, but how photography can be the trigger point for a new dialogue, to ask new questions and to open up to new readings of images. And this shows how presenting these images has to do with a theater background or scenography. This exhibition changed every 2 months in Karlsruhe, and it was like there were sort of 5 acts, like a theater piece, and the photographs were changed of placing by reading new themes. And these texts were also audible. So this was sort of a preparation of a theater direction. So what interested me was also having to do with a real space, presenting a script. And here, for example, I was trying to figure out the key elements of the different themes, the interconnections. And this was presented in a shape that was inspired by a system of links that is used in these works to change the pictures. What I mean is that this work has to do with fiction and reality together. So images are reality, but the exposition technique is fiction, because it comes from theater. And we also worked on texts and spoken words, so this exhibition was also like a radio drama in the space within You Can Move. And this is the exhibition in the PAC of Milan, where it was possible also to bring all the different themes in the same space. Another project, photographic project, not with my own photographs, but with 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏's archive. He was a photographer who was a Romance photographer who worked for 15 years in Sardinia. And this is a paparazzi archive. So I wanted to work with a genre of photography that is considered from the point of view of aesthetics and also ethics as something lower. And yet, as a thought-provoking process, I told myself that maybe his practice is the most actual practice to read the contemporary space. What is privacy? What is public, what is gender, what is the representation of male and female bodies. And so, together with Corrado, we took his 35,000 shots. It was 30 gigabytes of materials. And together with a group of graphics from Spector Brooks, from Lipsia, we created a software that was reading the metadata of the photographs. What I cared about was having complete sequences, because at the end, what we believe romance photography is, when we see an image on a journal, we don't see the image chosen by the photographer, but it is the image chosen by the distribution, the business center. Because Corrado was creating sequences, choreographic sequences, and then 10 would be left to the agency would give 5 to the magazine would choose 1, and then a journalist would write the text. So what we see here is the reproduction and distribution system, and we cared this choreographic, we cared for this choreographic side of this exhibition, which is in Sardinia, which is sort of a mapping, choreographic mapping of these sequences. And Corrado's archive also has the correspondence between a lawyer of a prime minister, Italian prime minister, and the privacy office, which has to do with pictures that were eliminated by the privacy office. So there is something political also about the system of distribution of this kind of photographs. This is another project with students of Karlsruhe, and this is about the Lampedusa island. An Italian collector asked me to take pictures in Lampedusa in 2010, 10 years ago. And at one point I decided not to I refused to produce new images, and we went to visit the different actors in the island, including the mayor, or Mauro Seminara, who is a local photographer. We also visited some NGOs working with immigrants who are minors, and we tried to understand how photographs are distributed on social networks and the Red Cross. So we wanted to see how these pictures were used in different ways from those taking part to these historical events. And afterwards, in order to publish this project, we decided not to publish the photographs as a thought-provoking idea, but also following the Carta of Rome that says that we shouldn't publish images of immigrants to respect their own privacy. So we invited students of the European and North Europe and North African schools to create illustrations for our book. So it's a photo book without photos, and then what came out of it was an exhibition. And the last project I would like to talk about is a project that is called Image Capital, together with Michel Blasque, who is an historian of photography. And here we are in the 𝗙𝗿𝗄𝐻𝚻 Institute in Florence, the artistic institute in Florence by the Max Planck Institute. And this was created in 1890, and this is an archive with metadata, we could say, but we also have the video camera for security purposes, which is recording students or researchers accessing this archive, which in itself is creating an archive of how the material is accessed. So this exhibition started from a conference that we had at the Centre Pompidou, and we wanted to take this essay in the space that is asking itself, what are the operational images of our world, contemporary world, used within production systems or economical systems, and to see what historical bridges are connecting these images from the 19th century, like this one, which comes from the archive of the Photothek by director Costanza Caraffa. And here we have different levels of metadata, because the image, before being part of the collection, was a part of a Florence gallery. And this image is about mirrors that were to be sold in London. So this image went to London with these codes and the prices. The numbers that you see around the mirrors are prices, but there is also metadata about the content, and Costanza can read by the calligraphy who was the person who archived this. This is another installation. And starting from Estelle research about microfilm, we present this number of Life, this edition of Life, where 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 already in 1945 was thinking about how to develop a machine for knowledge. So this is sort of a Google glasses, which was the Memex, sort of a pre-internet, analogical pre-internet on photographic print. This is interesting. George Eastman, already in 1910, he was a banker. He developed microfilms through Recordac, which was a sublet of Kodak. And already in 1920, all the libraries in America had already taken pictures through microfilm, so that the information could be distributed in different places. Here we are in the Iron Mountain, a mine that was turned into a deposit for data banks. We went to visit this together with Estelle. And two of the most important agencies, 𝗭𝗶𝗄 and Getty Images, have been bought by Bill Gates, and they keep their negatives here together with the negatives of the most important multinational companies of music and cinema, Western companies, of course, but also insurance companies. So this is a project that we want to present also in Italy, and we want to explore the history and of the technology of archives. Or here we are at CERN in Geneva. We want to see how data in the experimental data, this multitude of data, how are they stored and interpreted, read. We want to see how the technology for collection of data that we think are completely new and innovative, when we speak about machine learning or artificial intelligence, as a matter of fact, as shown by this picture, this is something that had already been developed in the 60s or experimented with in the 60s. I think I am done, also because I have trouble with the photographic system. I have to push harder. This is, we are in Delft, Holland, and this is orchids industry. In this place, 7 million of orchids are produced every year. And this production system turns flowers into pictures by being photographed 30 times from 30 different points of view without any human being. And it's the system that decides whether decides the market and the price of each flower according to their quality. So the system decides whether each flower will be sent to the north of Europe or the south of Europe, as buds in the north of Europe or as full flowers in the south of Europe. And we have 15 women there working who take who have to take an aesthetic choice on these materials. Also, I would like to show some rendering ideas, which is systems They do not document the reality, but create the reality. For example, here we have the reconstruction of the Notre Dame Cathedral, a team of scientists, where Italy took part actually, is collecting data from the industry of video games and also from architects. They are trying to scan, to create a 3D image of Notre Dame, creating a sort of a Tetris for the reconstruction, rebuilding of Notre Dame. The very last project, 2 images. This is a project that is being developed together with Giulia Bruno, a photographer and biologist, a colleague of mine, in 𝗪𝗏𝗃𝗃, an institution in Berlin that financed a group of 15 geologists to analyze explorations that might figure out the Anthropocene, the new geological era, the coming new geological era. And we wanted to visit each single group, but due to COVID we couldn't. But this was sort of a luck, because we started a dialogue through Zoom, and we asked scientists to create their own photographic documentation of their process. And this archive that we created together with them is part of a dialogue, and we asked them to explain what is happening in every picture by filling in some forms. The idea is to create an archive that can be read in 20 or 30 years by possible scientific historians, but also to understand what is the production method of images in the science field, within a process that is not aesthetic, but is for sure cultural in nature. Thank you.
Grazie Armin.
Thank you, Armin. Maybe if we have some time at the end, I would like to go back to something that you mentioned, which is the relationship between image and text within the archive, in this case, which is something very Ghirresque. And the description of images within an archive is something that is almost a double-edged knife, because it allows for traceability. So it is functional to the nature of archives, but also it orients the reading. So it's sort of something that comes from above and forces us to see images in a certain direction. So I would like to say something else that you made me think of with your speech about what you mentioned at the very beginning, about networks. In your work of interacting with the audience, the participation, which you often require from the visitors. Why? Because there is a beautiful connection with the context of Luigi Ghirri. Every time that I had the chance to meet an author, a photographer, an artist who had worked together with Ghirri, we often spoke about these experiences, and something that often came out, or almost always, in terms of participation, was that the Ghirri home was a place where people would have long dialogues and exchanges. So it did go beyond specifics about work. There is no doubt that around his home, his lab, his workshop, his thinking, there was sort of a small research center. It was sort of the core for a research center that nourished the production of the photographic production that happened in Italy in the following decades, and is still being influenced by it. I would like to leave the word to Linda, who will tell us about a very specific case. So we go and speak about one single image. Good evening, everybody. I am also very happy to be here. Thank you very much, Francesco, for the invitation. I have been thinking for long about what I could speak about when I have to speak about Luigi Ghirri, which I love so much and for sure there are voices that are more authorial about him. During our first meeting, we spoke about the idea that Francesco already mentioned of the versatility of the images of Luigi Ghirri, meaning that he often worked on his own archive by using a photograph as the cover for a classical music LP, but the same image could be shown as a work of art in an exhibition. So this is a concept that is very important in a photographer's work, in an artist's work. So the idea of, like Francesco said, having images that are organisms. Images are something alive that trigger mechanisms in the visual side of the person looking. So I did not want to work about my own work tonight. I would like to speak about archiving as an issue. I work on historical photographs from the 19th century, and after a conversation I had with a student of mine, a Canadian student of mine, with whom of which I was telling Francesco about. So an issue came out of this discussion, and it was about one specific photograph. And the issue is about this character that I named Mortimer. Mortimer, of course, is not the real name of this man who has been shot in this picture in Japan. This is a picture from probably the 1860s. So Mortimer is also not the name of the author, and it is not the title of the photograph. This is a nickname, a British nickname, not Japanese, that I gave to this character to distinguish him from the several flower sellers, Japanese flower sellers that I collected over the years. And the flower seller is a subject that is being repeated over and over again in the Yokohama School of Photography, which is a current that was created as in 1859 the harbor of Yokohama was opened, which made this city as one of the main business centers for the exchanges with other countries. And it was a very important harbor also because it was next to Edo, what became Tokyo. So until that moment, Japan was a feudal, closed and isolated empire. Almost every photographer in this incredible current, the Yokohama School, or the Yokohama Shashin, Shashin means photography, well, they all had at least one picture in their business books, a picture of a flower seller. This was a subject that was very attracting for the Westerners visiting. And of course, these small architectures, these structures, these bamboo structures, made the streets of the town very peculiar. There is a description by a book in 10 pages called Japan Described and Illustrated by the Japanese by Francis Brinkley, a book from 1897. He spoke about these flower sellers as veritable walking bouquets. So he described these men as a kaleidoscope of colors that added movement and colors and shapes to the town. In the photographs of the Yokohama Shashin, the flower sellers were always shot in a photographic lab or workshop. They were not shot on the street as reportage or journalistic photography. Usually the background is always neutral, and they are aware of the fact that they are being photographed. So they always keep on having these poses that are statue-like. Structures usually take the same space within the frame. as all the photos of the flower sellers. It's almost like there is a rule saying that all the flower sellers need to be photographed in the same way, even though this rule doesn't exist. It's more like an attitude to copying. Not, it's an homage. So photographs tend to be very similar. It's impressive. There is an idea that is very interesting, that is about figuring out the creativity not in the subject, but in the sides of the images. So the subject has been selected by other photographers previously. So until now, I collected 26 examples of flower sellers. There are actually 29 if we include some replicas. They are all originals, album and prints, and they are glued to cardboard. There are at least 3 that I do not own. 2 of them I couldn't find, and 1 I think is not cliched enough, so I never bought it. If we wanted to force the situation, we could say that this flower seller is a motif, as 𝗟𝗶𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗶, the founder of Iconology, described it. Of course, he was speaking about a storytelling scheme, a very complicated one. Photography often is inspired by painting, and there is a lot to say about this, but we don't have the time today. But the theme of motif, of the repetition of a subject, is very dear to me. It's the key of my photographic research, generally speaking. Specifically, in my collection about Japan, I follow motifs. For example, photographs of the Fuji mountain. It's a topos. It's like the picture of a person who is always there. Well, this is the difference between my collection and a museum collection, which is usually based on the idea of difference, of enrichment, of variety of materials. Well, I like to concentrate on the same subject. Mortimer, this name, this ironic name that I gave to this subject, is what distinguishes the subject, the person that is posing, from the subject that is shot. So a genre portrait, an occupational portrait, which is about the job that is being done. Within my collection, 4 pictures, 4 shots are exactly the same person, replicas of the same position, and 1 is from the side, a profile. For sure, these were taken in the same photographic session, and we cannot tell which one was shot first. As Mortimer was printed from the same matrix, a glass negative that was the same dimension or size of the print, it probably went lost in one of the 2 fires of Yokohama in 1866 or 1886. Well, this subject, as long as negative existed, this subject was highly easy to copy it or to reproduce it. And yet, my Mortimers are different from the others' iteration because they have been colored by hand, and the hand coloring is never identical from one image to the next one. This coloring is very typical and recognizable from that time and that place. This is a transparent color. Probably they have been aniline dyed, and the first one to really spread it was the Italian photographer 𝗕liche𝗶, who had a British passport, who took photographs in the war of Crimea, India, Burma, and China, and who started living in Yokohama in 1863. So, as the print of photographs is something very mechanical, there is here the hand of an artist, or actually a craftsman, This is a person who decided to put a certain tone of skin color on the face of Mortimer. He decided that his dress would be light blue, and he decided that the flowers were yellow or rose. And we could ask ourselves whether that kimono was really of that color and whether there are purple daisies and yellow daisies. So the color photography doesn't exist yet, so the colorist tries to apply the verisimilitude art. In English, we would say true to life. Some authors were very well known for their ability of making colors credible, believable. And for example, Kipling, Rudyard Kipling, the writer, as he visited Japan in 1889, wrote, "In Japan, you have to buy photographs, and the best are from the 𝗙𝗏 and Company studio. 𝗙𝗏 is a nice and eccentric chap. A colored photo makes you think of a horror, and it normally is so. However, 𝗙𝗏 knows how to color well and can reproduce the light tones of that beautiful country. From over the bridge on the ship, I was laughing at his red and blue hills. But once I reached there, that place, I realized that what he had painted was real." So I would like to comment, to make two comments about this sentence by Kipling. A colored photo makes you think of a horror, and it normally is so. Why this? Well, colors in photography is perceived by Kipling as something that goes against nature. What nature? The nature of the photographic medium. I was laughing at his red and blue hills, but once I reached there, I realized that what he had painted was real. Kipling uses a metaphor here, but indirectly, it is interesting that he connects realism to photography. So photography is something you can trust, trustworthy, but something fictional is painting, art. And he says that what he had painted, but we should say colored actually, was real. A reproduction, an exact reproduction of what you see. Well, I would like to recreate the biography of these photographic objects, my 4 Mortimers, the copies that reached me. The medium is usually a good starting point. As we said, these are albumin prints that were created from a glass negative that was put in touch with some photosensitive paper. The printing process had great success in the 1850s because it gave a lot of detail, and there was a lot of a wide range of tones. The yellow side on the top left photograph is a typical sign of a photograph that became old, an old woman print that became old. And Mortimer is not an especially rare photograph. There are hundreds of similar photos, all labeled as 103 dot selling flowers. The negative was sold from one photographic studio to the next one. That's why there are prints of the same photograph, and I own one of them, that are labeled as 1515 dot selling flower. There's also a version without any label, where there is a catalog number, 103, and it is written by hand on the negative, as you see, and it is printed in white within the image. It is obviously very difficult to figure out the authors of the Yokohama photographs. They were not signed because their authors didn't consider them as a work of art, and of course there was no law about copyrights. And the negatives would change ownerships from one studio to the next one, and this is why the authors are still a mystery to us. And we also should think that the original albums were often separated so that single photographs would be sold for a higher price. So many were lost in the process. As I research in museum archives that have some photographs from the Yokohama school, I often have the suspicion that some authorships have been attributed lightly. Let's talk about Mortimer, for example. In the recent book 𝗕𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗃, dans l'atelier photographique de 𝗕liche𝗀𝗏𝗃𝗃𝗃 2016, the Musée d'Art Contemporain, Moderne Contemporaine of Strasbourg, they present this picture as something dated 1880. This Mortimer I have, and also that Mortimer there, have 103 as a series number. As you see, it's circled in red over there. In the Strasbourg, that has been colored by hand, the color is written by hand, like in mine, that is a sepia-like color. It has been printed from the same matrix, that is obvious. And the other Mortimer in my collection, it's identical, but the label is, it's on the right-hand side on the bottom, and it says 103 selling flower. Felice Beato, who is the author, according to this book, well, he used not to put numbers or serial numbers on his photos, so it is difficult that this is a picture by Beato. There is also another print of Mortimer that has no number, and it is in the Alinari collection, one of the most important photographic archives in the world. As I saw this picture, without any label nor number, I thought, oh, that is true, it is Beato's picture. Beato, the most well-known photographer, the most mysterious one, the beginner of the Yokohama school. Everybody hopes that one picture belongs to him within their collections. His name increases the value of each picture, and yet, if we observe the picture better, we will realize that the Alinari picture has been cut on the bottom, exactly where normally there would be the label, the inside label of the print. The print was glued once again on a cardboard, and it was labeled on the carton, on the cardboard, as selling flower, without any catalog number. The Alinari are the only ones who didn't dare to attribute authorship to this print. The Strasbourg attribution to Beato is an isolated case, and it seems to be wrong. The manual enumeration was important for another author of the Yokohama school, the Austrian Baron Raimund von Stilfried. The version I have is labeled like this. The photo, the label that is on the inside, non-glued part of the photograph, is usually associated with other photographers, Japanese photographers. And it is very interesting that every single one of them, as you see, was using a different typographic character, and experts are trying to attribute photographs according to the typographical character used in the different studios. 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗏𝗃𝗏, the most talented Japanese photographer, used labels, typographic labels for his images. It is interesting to know that Quimbay worked for von Stilfried and for Beato for many years. And at one point, in 1885, He acquired their archives and he started working on his own. At this point, we could formulate an hypothesis. As we know that 𝗕𝗏 had worked for von Stillfried and he had acquired these negatives, we could think that the print with a label, this one, is a negative by von Stillfried printed in the 𝗕𝗏 studio. As a matter of fact, many museums and the international collections agree in attributing the image to 𝗕𝗏. This is the National Gallery of Canada, the National Gallery of Victoria, the Birmingham Museum of Art, the National Gallery of Australia, the Syracuse University Art Museum. And yet, there is a big problem here. Whether authorship belongs to the person who took the shot or the person who printed it out and sold it is a problem. In one of his essays, a very important essay, Thomas Mitchell notes that in the British language, in the English language, but not in German or Italian, nor Italian, there is a distinction between image and picture. Picture is the material support on which an image appears. And again, Ghirri, with these images being fixed on different supports. Sometimes negatives by photographers are printed after their own death. We can think of Gary Winogrand or the very well-known case of Vivian Maier, a recent discovery. We speak about posthumous editions, and we can also find an edition that has been that comes from the estate or the family of a photographer, so that the value increases. In a photographic fair, I found a picture by August Sander, printed by Gerd Sander in 1991. And this was indicated by the reseller as a guarantee for authenticity. This should ensure that the photo, the negative, is original. Again, the image is original. So this is a replica, but it is an unauthorized replica. But in the case of Yokohama photography, the materiality of the object, the picture, not the image, acquires importance and becomes dominant. A museum archive, many museum archives, decided to attribute the photograph to the person who printed it out, colored it, and sold it. Not to the person who decided the pose for this man, looking through the camera to take a shot that is unique, that is a fragment of time in history. As we said, in the second half of the 19th century, at least 2 images were taken on the same day, in the same photographic session, in the same studio in Yokohama, a front photo and a profile photo. The profile one that I own and that you see here is labeled as 1572 Selling Flower. The number of catalog, the catalog number is very distant from 103 that we saw before. The typographic character is different, and also there is a spelling mistake, flower as singular and not flowers plural. This is typical. These labels often have spelling mistakes because they were written by Japanese for Westerners, travelers. To my profile photo, there is a correspondence with another photo in the Alinari archive that is again identified as unidentified author. What is interesting is that in Prague, a museum has the same picture. It has a label of 1515, selling flower, but the author is not even mentioned in the online archive. The same catalog number is in this photo, in this photo book, old Japanese photographs, which is sort of a Bible for the collectors of these objets de plaisir. The Mortimer here has its number 1515 with spelling mistake, and it is attributed to 𝗙𝗂𝗁𝗍 Reigi, a different name. But if we consider the number of catalog, the character, we can say that this does not come from the studio, from 𝗕𝗏𝗍's studio. So, what can we say? I hope you're not too bored with this story, but there is a conclusion here. We can suppose that there have been that two different negatives were produced in the same afternoon. I imagine it was afternoon anyway. The front one and the profile one. In the same day, by the same author, who is unknown, but who at that point, but at one point, the two negatives were separated and ended up in two different catalogs of two different studios. If we attribute this image to a specific name, is what we, if we attribute an author, this would be educational guess. And I'm surprised that a museum archive has this, is certain of an author and can say 𝗪𝗂𝗃𝗁𝗵𝗵 or another name. This need to find an author for this image comes also from the fascination that we have for the biographies of adventurous types who went beyond rules, but it goes against the nature of photographic objects, which are mass products produced for business purposes. I think, I have the feeling that in this case, museums decided to an authorship that belonged to an unknown author, and that they were working on an object and not an image, and maybe they were not even aware that they were facing an academic exercise of attribution, and maybe they didn't realize that not only Mortimer had a doppelganger, but also the author had many different possible names. So I do believe that the pictures by Yokohama contain in themselves a series of elements, conceptual elements, that make us think about the deep nature of the photographic medium. It's the mise-en-scène of a disappearing world, the repetition of an iconographic tradition, the 𝗙𝗀𝗃𝗁𝗍, through photographs, and the manual intervention in a mechanical production, and the business character, commercial character of this kind of image that is not artistic in nature. And once again, the difficulty of figuring out the authorship of these pictures. Maybe this could seem like a philosophical problem, but as a matter of fact, the archiving Mortimer has to do with the status of image, especially when being read 180 years later.
Grazie Linda.
Thank you very much, Linda.
Faccio un lavoro di ricucitura, no, rispetto anche ai temi che ha affrontato Ghirri nel corso della sua storia.
I would like to say something that connects your work with Ghirri's work. He spoke often about copies, or as a matter of fact, he defined photographs not as copies but as analogs, and he thought very much about the ambiguity of photographs. And you gave us an essay about this, starting from a single image, and he used the term ambiguity, but, you know, figuring out the best term would be probably enigma you would say there is an enigma behind photography. So his relationship with reality, the status of reality that defines photography and what it represents. But if we were to talk about this, we would need a long time, which we cannot really go in depth right now. I would like to leave the word to 𝗚𝗏𝗏𝗏, who is a curator, who works in a similar way. She has to use photographs to attribute to them meanings that go beyond, or new readings that go beyond what was originally intended.
Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you for this wonderful invitation. I think. Yeah. So thank you for this wonderful invitation to talk about photo archive. I will share with you different ideas that are very dear to me relatively to photo archive. The first one being the question of the materiality of photo archive. Then this idea that archive is about link. And the idea, kind of versatility that you evocated, that is this idea of the many lives of a photo archive. So as you said, I'm a curator and historian, and I've been lead to work in different photo archives. I like to say I have a kind of nomadic approach of archives. I've worked in the archive of the Observatory of Paris, in the photo archive of the Ministry of Agriculture, National Office of Forest, in UNESCO, National Library, in different archives that are private and public. I now work for a very specific private collection, which is an archive called Archive of Modern Conflict, which is based in London and was created in 1992, first collecting archive of conflict, photos of conflict, but then encompassing all kinds of photographs, mainly vernacular. And it preserves more than 8 million photographs from negative, positive, object, artifacts. And we like to say it's a kind of laboratory. So my first encounter with a photo archive is very common. I think maybe some of you share it with me. It's my family archive. I used to, when I was a kid, to spend a lot of time in a suitcase we had at my grandfather's house with many photos. And I used to immerse myself in it, to dive in it, to manipulate them. And it was a really beautiful way of traveling through space and also through time. Through space, because my family comes from North Africa. So before Google, before internet, it was a way to discover plants, color. The colors often faded away, but well, it's very emotional, of course. This kind of photos. It talks about loss, disparition as well. And the way I've worked with archive is similar to this childhood experience. And this was in the French Society of Photography that I headed for 5 years. And here, when you work with collection of archives, you manipulate the image. So you are in contact with them, you care for them, you preserve them, put them in boxes, inventory them, try to enlighten them, and you're very close to it. And this is the idea that they are objects. They are in 3 dimensions, and this question of archive being an object is something that I've tried to share in exhibitions. For example, the first one, a big one I did in the International Festival for Photography in Arles, offered me the opportunity to show in another way pioneer work of photography. Here you have a very early photograph by Nicéphore Niepce, who is the inventor of photography, one of the inventor of photography. It's from the early 18, and showing it by the back, allowing to see the back and the verso and the recto, would allow to see that there were writings. There was writing at the back. He offered it to his good friend Daguerre. So it tells a lot of things. So showing the versos. This is here the first daguerreotype by Daguerre that you can see on the right. It's a very strange image because it has disappeared. It's a very well-known image. You see it on the right. It's a reproduction on the right made in the 1920s. And these photos is in all histories of photography. But the real object, the one that is preserved, is fade away. It's disappeared. And I find that interesting as well because the image is still beautiful. It looks like a screen. It's an archaeological object, but it is also very futuristic. So talking about the materiality of images is not doesn't always mean to only show the vintage original objects. And in this exhibition, I curated in National Gallery of Canada from a collection about the gold rush. This collection was gathered by Archive of Modern Conflict and donated to the National Gallery of Canada. And I wanted to reflect in this exhibition the vertigo of sharpness that Samuel Morse, who was the inventor of telegraph, when he first saw a daguerreotype in 1839, he was shocked by the sharpness, and he said he had this huge vertigo. He had never seen such a sharp image. It was like incredible. It's a bit like maybe 3D for us today. And to restitute this vertigo, we worked on reproducing in the best way the images, enlarging them. And all the book also was talking about the connection between gold and silver, between the medium and the image, the picture and the image, because all those daguerreotypes were toned with gold in order that they'd last longer. And you see here, the image on the right is very much enlarged, and so much enlarged that in the black you can see the little silver grains. And you can also see that the nuggets are retouched with gold. These images are very early images. They last from the 1849, the first gold rush in California. Another thing that when you work in a photo collection, heritage collection, you realize quickly is that there's a great photo diversity of archive. Photo archive can be of different size, very small, very big. They can be on different medium. They're not only on paper, they're on glass, they're on silk, they're on metal, they're on tin here. And this image on the right is interesting because it's the equivalent of a negative. It is a matrix to print photomechanical images. It's like a negative. And this is an image that was overlooked, of course, like negative. For a long time, museums have not been interested in collecting negative, nor libraries. But negative in photo archives, national archives, have always been welcome. Because there is this thing in the deontology of the archivist that you don't hierarchize documents. You treat them the same. It's very democratic. You pay the same attention if the document is black and white or in color, if it's signed or not signed, if it's on metal or on paper. Of course, the market of photography has led us to think there is a priority or there is a hierarchy with the vintage prints above. But photography is a big family of many, many different objects, including here you can see sealed envelopes. Other photos are not alone, and they are often accompanied with, like here, tools, photometers. Photometers were made to measure time exposure. Before electronic, it was very important. once again, photographs in archive are not alone, and this is very interesting to keep this entirety. Here you see this big cyanotype, blue, from 1887. It was in an envelope preserved with other documents, and you can see a little glass that has been struck by lightning. And this photographer, who was an Austrian researcher, he did photograph a lot these little glass plates. And having preserved the archive this way allows us to understand it better. So that's why I like to say that photography is about link. It's about the link in between one image and objects around it. It's about the link in between images. Here you see this image we've already seen. It's a photo on silk, and it is accompanied by a recipe, notes taken by the inventor to relate about this, describe this, his tests. Often in administration, in photo archive administration, the photos are accompanied by data, as you said. Here it's reports. It's a huge archive of 10,000 prints of inventions that were photographed from the First World War in France. And the report is very interesting here because it helps understand what is the invention about. It's a gas mask for horse. And what it helps us to understand as well is that it's a failed invention. And most of these archives that are exhibited also in Arles and in Italy, in Mast, was very exciting because it was about failure. Most of the subjects were failure, and this is, in the end, what innovation is about as well. You need to fail a lot, as Samuel Beckett was saying, to succeed, to invent something. So this is a related book. So there are many images that have been also overlooked, such as the one that accompanied the production of images, its apparition. And this photographer is now quite well known as a pioneer of photography because 𝗙𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗃, he made the first self-portrait in the history of photography. It's kind of considered as the first artistic photograph in 1840. Sorry, it's a mistake. And I got interested in what he did before that. In 1813, he realized an album of tests where he it's the very beginning of photography. He just tested the photosensitivity of substance to light. And the images are beautiful, but they are not fixed. They are only stabilized. So when we look at this album, we damage it, so we don't look at it. So we had to develop a partnership to find a company that could reproduce it without light, which is difficult. And then we enlarged those beautiful images, and we discovered that before, thanks to digitization, before his self-portrait, he did other self-portraits. All that to say that the history of photography is very linked to the history of preservation. So these are early tests of durability of photographs. So I'll finish with this idea of the many lives of the archive. Photo archives are very tempting to reappropriate. They are a wonderful material for artists or historians to reappropriate. And I had the opportunity in the French Society of Photography to find a wooden box that preserved some images that had suffered in a flood. And these images were wonderful. And I decided with colleagues to do a book about it. Why? Because in archive, mold is the #1 public enemy. A mold photograph is something that we forget, we remote. And when in fact you can see through this image that microorganisms have a huge potential, huge aesthetic potential. They are creative, and they have transformed those images. And the one I chose to publish had this link in between the image and the alteration, the modification. Here, it's like a bird flight, but on a lake. But in fact, these white stains are it's the gelatin who has been eaten by the microorganism. So it takes the image with it because the silver image is in the gelatin. And here the alteration looks like a Milky Way. And the image itself is a Milky Way. So the whole book is made of those kind of images. So I just wanted to finish with that because you can see that images are, I'm not saying that they are living, but they transform themselves with time, and they show the mark of the time passing, and these transformations are part of the images. And often in photography, we consider the image when it's perfectly preserved, etc. But all those traces of life, like they're getting old, they also are beautiful, and they are like archaeological object images, and it's good to look at like that at them. And also the question of versatility is what you talked about. It's really like, it's not only material, it's also conceptual. A photo can be one day looked as an archive, another day as a work of art, another day an illustration, and then back to the archive. And this amazing kind of versatility of photograph is what I think makes us love it so much as well. And because it questions what is art, what is an artist. And, voilà. Thank you.
Versatilità.
Grazie anche a 𝗚𝗏𝗏. Mi piace molto quello che Luce ci ha detto e ci ha mostrato.
Thank you very much to 𝗚𝗏𝗏. Thank you for what you said and what you showed us, the fragility of photographs. We are used to think of photography as a medium that is very strong. We speak about the fact that what is shown in a photograph is immortal. We often spoke about the shooting, the gesture of taking the picture, but photography, if we think of photography in terms of objects, it is a very fragile and delicate medium. It's precarious, and seeing this in this light under this light is very interesting. I would like to give the microphone to Francesco Garutti, a curator of CCA, the Canadian Centre for Architecture, who, as a matter of fact, years ago, hosted images, very important images by Luigi Ghirri that were hosted together by curator Aldo Rossi. And I think you will show us this world-famous exhibition. Thank you very much for the invitation. What I would like to do tonight is, as you said, Francesco, to show also that exhibition we that took part in 1986. This is when Luigi Ghirri's history crosses over the CCA work, but at the same time, I would like to think in terms of the approach of the CCA to the idea of archive that, in my opinion, has to do with the landscape of images and the ecology of images. But Marco, you were mentioning the idea of storytelling and series. So I would like to tell how our way of working with an archive has a lot to do with the way that Luigi Ghirri had to work with his images. So in order to reach this, I would like to introduce you to the Canadian Centre for Architecture. This is an image from a few years ago. This is downtown Montreal. This is the building in the center. That building is actually the CCA. It was founded in 1979 by Phyllis Lambert, and it's an institution that has a very hybrid nature because it is a museum, it has a large collection of architecture, drawings, photographs, printouts, books, and materials that have to do with the research in terms of a space that has been experienced. But it is also a research center, an international research center, where scholars and curators and students can go, and it is open to anyone. You just need to send an email to get access. So everybody has an opportunity to go through the materials. But it is also an exhibition center. So this is an hybrid structure that has a lot to do with the methodology in the institutional work that I would like to speak about today. This is a sentence by 𝗙𝗏 Lambert, the founder of the institution. Maybe everything is in the for. The word for is the Canadian Center for Architecture. This is because we don't work with Canadian architecture, and we also are not an institution that only speaks about architecture. So in that case, it could have been the Canadian Center of Architecture. But our center is for architecture. So our mission, the mission of the institution, is the idea of reasoning and using architecture to explore themes that have to do with the contemporary life, or the contrary, to trying to explore the themes of contemporary life for architects, so those who work with building space. We try to understand how they are changing and the extension, the logics of space. So how do we do that? We are going to try to tell this through a series of images. First of all, the collection, which starts from old history to become something that speaks about present. So it starts from, in this collection we can find old prints from actually the Renaissance to the presence of great masters of the last 60 years. This is an image that is very well known, the Cemetery of San Cataldo by 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗏, two key figures to the development of the last 60 years of reasoning in terms of space in architecture. The idea of flexibility, the idea of transformation, the work of the archive with its models and tools and objects that are part of it, until reaching contemporary artists. This is a work by Douglas Copeland. This has been commissioned, produced by the CCA. These are 100 slogans for the 21st century that were installed after having been commissioned for an exhibition about environment. They were installed around the fence of the museum, sort of a critical reflection about what ecology is nowadays, but environmentalism is nowadays. But the real nature of the collection ways of preserving in somehow the memory of authors of the CAA has to do with the idea of borders, the idea of the process. That's why the quotation by 𝗙𝗏 Lambert was about the fact that we are not interested in presenting architecture, we're interested in making people think about architecture. So this is the key word to our approach to our archive. We do not acquire a final model of an architectural project. We often acquire the process, the notes taken on a paper in a restaurant, the thoughts, any kind of material shape that shaped up the idea of the final work. Some examples. These are small cards that 𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗏 would give to his clients to indicate how to treat or work on some surfaces of the architecture that he was creating. These are notes by architectural master Frank Lloyd Wright in his last edition, the last pre-printout of When Democracy Builds. This is all about, this goes about the first images by Dan Graham, who before building his sculpture reasons on the themes of cities. This is an image of New York in the 80 building, just before, in the early 80s, as the city is turning into something else, and when the problems of private and public spaces are central to the discussion, the public discussion that they're having about building spaces at the basis of buildings. A letter by Gordon Matta Clark, who is trying to understand in which way he can have buildings explode by contacting producers. So he really was an artist who worked on the idea of transformation of the material. He is famous for his cuts. And right now he's trying to understand how explosive could help him work to produce his works. And this is a central document, just like, again, Gordon Matta Clark. This is a tool that he used to use to hang his own body on the sides of buildings to physically reach and cut into fragments the buildings that he would open up to light and change the perception of the building and space itself. So this is our way, this is the nature of what is at the basis of the CCA collection, cuts and shots. These are fragments of models by Peter Eisenman that have been preserved by the architect with great care, and this is very important. It's a very important part of our collection. And also samples of cloth that are part of filters of the architecture by 𝗵𝗁𝗺, the Indian architect. Another way about taking care of the contemporary by use of history, by use of a collection, this is through exhibitions that are never monographic. We don't like monographic exhibitions, single exhibitions, not really because we don't want to celebrate the single person, but because the shape of the dialogue is what is needed to face the themes that we care about. And using architecture as a mode for reading contemporary life. So here, very rapidly, these are some of the thematic exhibitions that we did in the last few years. These are about environment, about the relationship between health and the body. An exhibition about happiness. After the financial crisis of 2008, the immersion of these happiness indexes started influencing the standards and the ways of creating architecture. An exhibition that became a sort of a TV show. An exhibition about education on architecture, reaching back to a pioneer case of the BBC that worked in the 70s about university cases through radio and TV. So architecture was one of the main pillars of this range of university cases. The rewriting of the history of modern architecture in Africa. But to us, exhibitions are dialogues, as we said. This is another modality that we worked on.
Coppie di progettisti e artisti,
Pairs of
figure che hanno lavorato sulla produzione e la lettura dello
pairs of artists who worked on space in a dialogue between themselves, talking about technique and technology, history, context. These are some of the highlights of recent exhibitions. On the top left, you see a dialogue that we created between the office of 𝗙𝗵𝗵𝗶𝗃𝗀𝗰, which explored the idea of context in extreme conditions like the north of Mongolia and rural China. And then, once again, what we mentioned already, another case that was at the beginning of this format of exhibitions as dialogues. This was Paolo Costantini, the curator, in the 1990s, created a series, which was unfortunately stopped too early because he passed away, in which the work of an architect would meet the work of a photographer. These are images from that exhibition, where photographs by Ghirri on the work of 𝗟𝗏𝗃𝗃 were presented in the octagonal gallery of the CCA through a strange instrument, this glass wall. As you see this display with Polaroids that were shot by Aldo Rossi during his life were collected on sort of a net in a dialogue with the works by Ghirri. By rereading the texts and the letters that were exchanged between the two, this is something I would like to speak about. It is interesting how through Ghirri and the relationship, the empathic relationship that generated a series of photographs that were radical in nature for the concept of architecture photography. Well, through that, we also invited Rossi to reconsider his work on Polaroids and to turn it into a display that lived in our exhibition, in our galleries. These are some of the images that were taken, and it's sort of private views by Aldo Rossi. These are two texts published in the catalogue of the exhibition, where Rossi speaks about Ghirri, and Ghirri tells about his meeting with the work, with Rossi's work. Of course, archives are a territory for research, and they present, and I would like to present two more examples of formats that we started acting on in the CCA in order to understand how to make it accessible, how to make an archive accessible. One has to do with the problem of digital rendering. How can we create a digital archive? This is a letter, almost a private letter, that we sent to our readers, in which we try to understand how to solve this dilemma. Where do we start from? Should we start from picture number 1? From drawing or note number 0? How do we recreate and create a digital, accessible word, starting from such a complex ecosystem of materials? We decided to do it through a curatorial way. We invited historians, critics, to help us digitalize the archives. So it was a program of residencies. You see Forster here working on Rossi's archive, Michael Meredith working, and these residencies created a selection of materials. Each critic or historian that we invited started their reading of the archive from a specific theme, perspective. Michael Meredith, for example, decided to work on irony. This produced a process of curated digitalization. By curated, I mean that there was a curator behind it, and each author wrote an essay on his intervention on the collection, and they made the archive accessible to the world through histories, through stories, stories that come from their eyes, their approach to the theme. Just a few final words in this presentation about methodology and approaches to creating a thought about contemporary life through the CCA, with this recent project that is a metaphor for many different things. It is part of a series of researches and exhibitions that we defined as out of the box. It has to do with the possibility to use an exhibition as the first approach to exploring something. Of course, archives are being studied by scholars, and they are processed by our professionals, but we wanted to use this exhibition as a system without discipline in creating relationships. So, 𝗵𝗃, the artist I spoke about already, this is 𝗟𝗏𝗵𝗃. This is an artist whose collection is part of our archive. This is a very specific archive because it is not only an archive of works, but everything that came before, after, and around the work of 𝗵𝗃. So 3 curators were invited to a residency. 𝗟𝗶𝗃𝗃𝗃, 𝗟𝗶𝗃, and 𝗵𝗃 were invited to investigate these materials and to produce 3 different views, 3 different lectures. And within their researches, what is interesting is that they took very specific views on this private library. So the idea was to study an author not through his works, but through the books that he was reading, where he would take notes. And 𝗵𝗃 worked on his photographs taken through during trips. These are private photos that were taken during private trips or professional trips, but most of them are very private shots. And then the cinematographical, the cinema part. That was very interesting because she didn't watch the films that 𝗵𝗃 produced on his works. She looked at what was left in the trash bin. So the idea was to recover materials that were left aside by the editors that worked on those movies. And so they wanted to reconstruct, through these 3 components of the archives, 3 different exhibitions. This is the 𝗟𝗏𝗃𝗃's exhibition about the books. This is 𝗵𝗃 with the photographs, with the travel photographs, and 𝗟𝗶𝗃 on the materials that were left on the floor of the editing room. So we wanted to recover the context of an work, that in this case is very physical but also conceptual, the margins, the leftovers of a production, help us reread the center, the core. And this is how I would like to come to an end. Thank you, Francesco Garutti, for what you told us, what you showed us. In this context, you showed us photographs from Luigi Ghirri's exhibition that we would not be able to see. These photographs are almost impossible to find. So I know we are beyond our time schedule. I hope it was pleasant. And I would like to come to an end very quickly by saying that it was a pleasure that by speaking of archives, in the end, all of us spoke about photography, the nature of photography, of the body of photography, the language of photography, which is one of the bearing themes of Ghirri's work. Whatever he took a shot of, whatever was in front of his camera, was the object of an investigation about his own language, his own practice, and By the way, Ghirri was recovering and studying photography by recovering other images in a very peculiar way, speaking about archives. This was not really an archive, this was more of a collection. He would take a photo of other photographs. He would take photos of maps, of paintings. He had a passion for geographical maps. He was taking photos of drawings, of advertisement posters. And I would like to say that here, in this period, there is an exhibition about a series by Ghirri that revolves around posters, advertisement posters, so photographs of other pictures, carton box landscapes, one of his early series, one of his early photographic works, and I would like to thank the lecturers and everybody. Thank you.